And we're back. Welcome to episode 5 of Sound Advice, Get Year 1 in Business Right, brought to you by Sage. I'm Bex Byrne-Callender and we are halfway through the season, so thanks so much to everyone that's been listening over the past few weeks. This time, we're looking at a really fascinating startup conundrum, how you take a brand new invention or technology and turn it into a viable venture. This is what Sound Advice is here for, to unpick the most complicated problems so that they seem a breeze. To help me do that today, I am joined by an exceptional entrepreneur and inventor, Solveiga Pakštaitė, the founder of Mimica. Now, if, like me, you've ever looked at that pack of mints in the fridge, seen it's a couple of days past expiry and wondered, dare I? Then you're going to absolutely love this business. Solveiga has created food expiry labelling tech that actually tells you when things are off. Goodbye arbitrary expiry labels, hello massive reduction in food waste. She came up with this amazing innovation at university and has turned it into a massive success. So without further ado, let's hear all about it. Solveiga, welcome and thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing on this grey, rainy London day?
Very well, thank you. Rainy here as well, so I guess we're matching.
Thank you so much for coming to talk about your business today. It's such a fascinating story that I kind of just want to start from the beginning. Do you mind just taking us on a whistle-stop tour of how Mimica came to be? You were at Brunel University, is that right? Tell me how you came up with this idea.
Yeah, of course. So I studied industrial design at Brunel University, which is just another term for saying product design, which I think people are more familiar with. And I was always interested in the idea of inclusive design. I did a year in industry where I got the chance to work with people with visual impairments on a transportation project, and on kind of long journeys on trains while we were doing observations. I got a chance to kind of ask some really nosy questions, which was really fun. And, I kind of learnt that it's a huge issue for people with visual impairments, knowing when their food really spoils, because at the moment expiry dates are all visual. So I went back to my final year, decided that would be a really interesting topic for my final major project, and very quickly realised that we're all kind of blind to when our food really spoils, which is why we waste so much. 60% of the food that we throw away here in the UK is still perfectly edible. So the expiry date system has been needing an overhaul for a while. So what I ended up developing is a label that tells you exactly when food spoils by changing its texture. So when it's smooth, it's still perfectly safe and fresh to eat. And only when you feel bumps, that's when you know it shouldn't be consumed anymore. And the way it works is that inside there's a gel which basically spoils at the same rates as food, and we can calibrate that spoilage by mapping and matching the spoilage characteristics of a specific food, such as, beef, and kind of making the gel as temperature sensitive as a piece of beef, and it's going to respond to temperature in the same way as it travels through the supply chain and into our homes as well.
That just sounds like magic. You had to come up with the solution and then actually find the right material with those properties so you can adjust and tweak to mimic the food in the packaging. I mean, how did you do this? I know that you were studying that at university, but are you just incredibly good at problem solving? Where did you start?
I actually got the idea by looking at an old banana. Its skin was changing and it was turning brown and spotty and a bit bumpy, and it was clear that the banana was not as young and fresh as it used to be, and it needed to be eaten soon. And I wondered, it'd be interesting if our packaging could respond like that as well, letting us know some key information about its freshness. I knew from that point that I would have to step outside of my comfort zone of product design and step into the world of chemistry and biology. And I actually reached out to a chemist on campus who suggested that I look into the field of gels, and he said it's a really unexplored material. It could be have some interesting properties for you, particularly as I was looking for a texture change. And it just took a case of playing around and kind of just studying the books to understand what would change its properties, and then just running loads of tests in the kitchen. And of course, these days, it's not just in my university kitchen. We have a lab team doing that 24 hours, running experiments 7 days a week.
I love that you weren't a chemist and that didn't stand in your way. I think for many people starting businesses, especially when they have ideas like yours where they're saying, wow, why hasn't this been done before? People then stop and they say, that's not my specialism. I didn't go to university to study that. But you came up against that wall, and instead of going, stop, you were like, hey, I'll just ask someone who knows. Incredibly, you just haven't let anything stand in your way. Is that very much a part of your personality, that you knock on doors and just keep pushing on?
I mean, the first thing is that we were encouraged on our program to become experts in whatever we were designing. So I kind of obviously took that very literally and basically did a honorary science degree on the side of mine unofficially, but and I think, you know, to achieve good design, you need to look at it from a multidisciplinary perspective. But I think kind of what made me actually go forward with that, I'm not I think for most of my life I've been willing to kind of take a punt and that kind of thing, and I've been thinking about where that all started. And actually as a very young child, I was incredibly shy, and we moved to the UK. I was a weird Lithuanian girl who had actually just moved from Norway, which is where I was born. So I had this really weird accent, and I stuck out like a sore thumb, like that. There was no way of me blending in, and obviously I was going to be subject to a bit of picking on and bullying. And my mum always told me, you need to stand up for yourself. You're not going to change who you are. And she kind of gave me a permission to punch people if I needed to. Usually your parents might tell you something else, but she was just like, no, if your teachers tell you off for punching someone, they can speak to me. And I think, while I don't know if I completely agree with that school of thought, I think that permission to punch is what made me realize from a young age that I didn't always have to follow the rules if it wasn't in my best interest.
Remind me never to get on the wrong side of your mom, because she sounds formidable.
Oh yeah, don't do that.
But I think I love her already. I want to come back to that. It's really interesting how you had to learn new skills and overcome some of the things that stood in the way of being successful. I do want to come back to that. But first, you did the Mimica project at university. It was just a project for uni. When did you decide it could be a business? Was that day one, or did you have a eureka moment where you thought this could be commercially viable?
There were two main steps that kind of made the accident that was turning this into a company happen. The first was that we did a final year exhibition to get some advice from industry. So we had all these industry people come in and give us advice on where we should kind of finalize our projects towards. And I was talking to this packaging designer about a very early concept of Mimica Touch. And at the end of kind of listening to me talk about it, he said, you should protect that. And that was the first time anyone had planted a seed in my head that this might be worth protecting that idea or doing something. So I was lucky enough to actually have some leftover scholarship money from the James Dyson Foundation. So I decided towards the end of the year, because actually that money was there to kind of take our projects to the next level, but because my materials were so cheap, I hadn't spent very much of it at all. So I decided to spend the rest of it on filing a patent. And I thought, again, this is just for me to learn how patents work. Another string to my bow. I'm sure I'll be filing a few during my career. And filed that. But then, because I was already in touch with James Dyson Foundation, they encouraged me to apply for their award, the James Dyson Award, which looks for the best solution that solves ideas every year. And I applied, forgot about it, started an internship. And in my second week of my internship, I got a call telling me that I'd won the UK James Dyson Award, which was an utter surprise to me. And I then went through a very intense and odd few weeks of being in the press a lot and doing all these interviews and being on the radio, and suddenly quite a few people were finding out about my concept. And food retailers and food producers started getting in touch with me, asking me for meetings, for me to write proposals, asking me, can we trial this? And at first my reaction was like, what are you talking about? This is just a concept and I'm just trying to get on with I'm a graduate, just trying to get on with my internship. But I was literally sneaking out at lunchtimes from this internship to have meetings at the head office at Coca-Cola and other companies. So it's quite a crazy time of my life. But I think I finished that internship and I'd been so busy doing Mimica stuff on the side. And I was telling my friends, gosh, I haven't lined anything new up after my internship. And they were like, what are you talking about? You're doing it. And so I think I was in denial about the fact that I was kind of starting to be an entrepreneur. And for me, it was just like, let's just see what happens with this. And I decided I'd give it 6 months and see where it goes. And yeah, we're still here. And now that I've got 10 people in my team, which is fantastic.
That is some serious denial, given that James Dyson, probably the most famous British inventor of recent years, was giving you 2 wedges of cash, saying you've got a really great idea, and you're still like, nah, that's not right for me. That's an incredible story. So how did you get on James Dyson's radar to begin with? You mentioned a scholarship fund. What was that? It might be more universities these days, but I think it was certainly 2 back when I was at university. It was Loughborough University and Brunel University. They have a really close connection to both of those design schools because they're the top ones, or were the top ones in the UK. I think Imperial's now like part of the top 3. There's a new rivalry there. But they basically gave away 6 £1,000 scholarships to final year students every year, and you just had to apply and explain why your project was interesting and why it was worth the extra funding and the extra push. So I was selected for one of those that year. That's amazing that £1,000 was your startup pot. And was that enough to get you going?
I mean, that was for the degree. That was for my final year, but that basically paid for the early materials that I used in my final year and for filing the patent. You know, that's not really going to get you very far. And I needed to apply for some more grants after the James Dyson Award as well, because that one was £2,000, I believe. And again, because I was in denial, I'd actually met a business consultant at my graduate show, and she was asking me, have you protected this idea? This is really incredible. And I was like, yeah, I actually filed a patent last week. So she was like, here's my card, like we should bring it forward to market. And I was like, yeah, but I took her card anyway. And then, you know, later on, you know, a few months down the line, I'd won the award, and kind of all this madness was happening to me, and all these food producers were wanting to talk to me. I was like I dug out her card, thank goodness I hadn't thrown it away. And I called her and I was like, Christina, help me. So she actually helped me write my first grant applications, because she said that that's what I needed to do first. And actually we won in the early days, about 75% of them. So that brought in a real chunk of cash that I could really start doing something with. And we set up a lab partnership with the University of Chester, which is still where our labs are today. And that allowed me to start hiring my first team members, which of course were scientists.
I didn't realise there are so many grants out there. That's really good advice. So if you have a new clever invention that could make a difference to the mass market, you don't have to go the traditional route of going to your bank manager. There's lots of pots of money out there. So how did you find them, or did your business consultant know just the best places to look?
She definitely knew. So I think, you know, if you're starting out and you're interested in grants, either speak to an entrepreneur. And most of the grants are kind of more for kind of social impact ideas. So not every type of business is going to be eligible for these kinds of things. But particularly if you're developing a technology, there's actually quite a decent amount of funding for that. But I think, to be honest, you can also have a Google, and there's also some platforms where you can have a look for some grants that you can apply for. One of them is called F6S. And then there's another one with a more strange name called UNoodle. So I would check out those 2 platforms and see, and you can literally filter everything. So I'm early stage, I'm working in agriculture, I'm helping farmers do this, that, and the other, and this is the amount that I'm looking for. And then it literally will filter out all of the grants that you can apply for.
And how quickly did you manage to get to market, and what did getting to market look like for you? Was that getting product on shelves or experimenting with brands? What came next in your journey?
Well, we're still at the stage where we're pre kind of proper launch. The lab work took a number of years before we got that working every time and with a chemistry that we could scale. But that didn't stop us working with brands to do some tests. So we did a large consumer study with a big dairy company, which was incredibly successful. I think what has to happen in parallel while you're developing the technology is checking that it's going to add value and consumers are going to want it by the time that you've finished developing it. So that works. So that's mostly the nature of the work that we've been doing with brands and looking at whether it will actually change behavior and is there a need for this, and who are going to be our early adopters and that kind of thing, and who do we market to when we first launch this. So that's all groundwork that we've been doing while we've been working on completing the development and then now the scale up, which is what we're working on.
What I'd love to know, and you've hinted at this, that it's quite tricky to go from something that works when you're doing it in your university kitchen through to something that works every time and is then scalable so you can manufacture in huge quantities. So how tricky was it? Talk to me about that process. You mentioned years, so take me through it step by step.
Yeah, a few different things had to happen, and definitely things that I wasn't equipped to do when I first started. So the first is I relied initially a lot of mentorship, people who really had the business expertise that I lacked. And even though I was kind of learning a lot every day, but I still can't replicate many years of expertise that other people have. So I set out to be a very avid learner and met a lot with people either in the food industry or kind of from other industries as well, because I think you can learn from lots of different disciplines. So I became a very promiscuous mentee, and eventually an opportunity turned up to bring kind of a couple of experts in-house to the company. It was actually from a company called It's Fresh. That is actually also in the smart packaging space, reducing food waste as well. They do it in a completely different way using different technology. They actually absorb the ripening hormones from the fruit and berries, which is super cool. And these two guys, the CEO and the CTO, they developed the company in 7 years, and they sold it for a really large sum, really impressive. And they were looking for their next thing. And I'd actually already been talking to the CTO at various packaging events, and I was actually introduced to him by head of innovation at Marks and Spencer, who said, I'd already been talking to the guy at M&S, but he introduced me to Laurie and said, he's a few years ahead from you, he could really teach you something. So kept in touch with him. He kind of mentored me a little bit, and then when they were exiting the company, he said, listen, myself and the CEO were exiting and we're looking for a new challenge. And they said that they were really interested in helping Mimica. So I had a chat with them, and I think I was at the stage where I was still running everything myself. So I had them scheduled in for an hour conversation. They came in, they ended up staying 3 hours just because how many stories they had to tell, and about like how to price it right and how to scale something from the lab bench to millions of units and all of that. And I knew straight away that they were going to save me light years in time and pain. And I brought them on board initially as consultants that I probably couldn't afford at that time, but I knew that I had to find a way to bring them on board. And then eventually, maybe 9 months in, I invited them both to have more formal positions in the company as our CEO and CTO. And at that point, I actually decided to step aside. So I think that's been a huge point, a strategy point. So realizing that I can't do it myself and knowing that I needed that help. And I think building the business case is something that they've really been able to help us do, which has been incredibly key. And then also shifting away. We still apply for grants, but just not relying on them so much anymore, and bringing in some investment.
This is really unusual. You were basically talking to a rival. Is it quite friendly in your industry and everyone just helps one another out?
Well, they weren't actually our direct competitor, I would say. They extend shelf life by actually removing the ripening hormone. They made these pads. They weren't labels. They were pads that went into the punnet.
Oh, I see. So you could almost use them together. They're almost complementary technologies.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's actually what Laurie and I started talking about. He was saying, can we extend shelf life and then prove it? So that's something that was quite interesting for them. But then they ended up doing that work internally at Mimica as well, and we're so lucky to have them on board. And both of their names are actually Lawrence, so one of them has to be called Laurie, and the other one we call Lawrence. He's our CEO, Lawrence.
But you met them at a trade show, you said. So is that a good idea if you have an innovation to go out to trade shows and meet people?
I'm not such a fan of trade shows. I actually met Laurie at a very small smart packaging seminar. There was literally 30 people there, and like the right people were in the room. So I'd actually look more for kind of smaller kind of boutique events. Boutique's the wrong word, but yeah, kind of niche events. Actually, the smaller the niche as possible. And it might sound like, and actually I had to travel 3 hours outside of London to go to this one seminar. I did actually have a speaking slot, so I think that made it worth my while. But you might show up and think like, gosh, I've done all this travel, what, to meet 29 people? But if they're the right people, like trade shows are so big, and I think actually, I don't think I'd recommend going to them when you're first starting out, because you'll just get lost. And I think you need to be in smaller, more comfortable rooms to really develop your value proposition and finding what works when you're talking to people. And that smaller setting is a really good test bed for that before you do the bigger shows.
That is brilliant advice. Solveiga, do you mind telling me about your funding history? So you've done some grants, but then there were other fundraising efforts. And have there been any bumps in the road?
So one story that comes to mind, it's not a very easy one for me to tell, but definitely a bit scarred from it. But, I started thinking about, maybe I should raise some investment. We've done quite well with grants, but they might not last forever. And I had this one angel investor, so private investor, really interested in what we were doing and had committed to put in some money, about I think £50,000. So that for me was a huge sum at that time, and actually still is actually. And because of how enthusiastic he was, and he said, the money's ready, the terms look good. He even gave me a date when the money was going to come in, and all that was left was for him to sign the contract and actually to send the money. And that day came, nothing. Couldn't get hold of him. Next day, the weekend passed, and absolutely couldn't get hold of him. He'd completely ghosted me. I guess got cold feet at the end, or not sure what happened. And because I was naive and I'd trusted that money was going to come in, I hadn't made any other provisions. I was kind of relying on that money coming in at that point, and because we'd run out of grant money at that point. And it got to the end of the month and I couldn't pay people. Of course, I was never going to let that happen. I would never get in a position where people wouldn't get paid for their work. So I had basically looked up, kind of as a plan B, some really high interest loans where I would have to put down my own name as security. So that means that they could go after me personally endlessly. But that was what I was willing to do for my team. But in the end, I was just like, that is absolutely stupid. Like, these interest rates are crazy. So I decided to, and I've never been the child who asked her parents for money. And I've always been taught that, you need to save for something, you need to be independent, that sort of thing. So it was such a moment of embarrassment for me to have to call my mum. And I actually really clearly picture this. We'd moved into a new office space, as in the office space was new and not all of the offices were decked out yet. So I found a room that hadn't been turned into an office yet, and I sat under a desk on the floor, called my mum sobbing, asking her if she would lend me any money, because I needed to pay my staff. And she agreed, but she said, just so you know, this is your wedding money that we've been saving throughout your whole life. So don't mess this up. So I yeah, of course, thanked her and took the money. And it wasn't a small amount, it was £10,000. And managed to pay my team. And of course, the next month was going to roll around and I had to pull in a new investor within 1 month. And I managed that. So that was made us more stable for a while. But gosh, it got hairy then. And I was slowly able to pay my mum off within a year after borrowing that. And that's actually when I realised that I should start charging for my time. I'd been quite lucky after winning the James Dyson Award that I've been invited to some kind of cool speaking gigs. I'd done a TED Talk earlier on, and then afterwards I was invited to speak at a lot of conferences. And I never thought to charge for my time. I was actually speaking to someone, actually an influencer called Lauren Singer. She's kind of active in the zero waste community. And I was telling her, about all this speaking stuff, and she was just like, oh, what rates do you charge? And I was like, I hadn't even thought to charge. And then I remember she put her hand on my knee and she was like, you don't work for free. And I will always remember that advice. And from then I started asking, for my time to be compensated. And that's slowly how I managed to pay my mum back in speaking engagements. So I'm really pleased that I learned that lesson and found a kind of new income stream for myself to support myself while building Mimica.
And the wedding fund is now safe, or has the wedding happened?
Yes, I'm now married. Got married in last month.
Oh, congratulations. You didn't have to do it in a back room in a railway man's club. You had your proper wedding. I'm happy for you.
Yeah, it was all good. But I think what that taught me is that, especially if it's someone that you haven't known for that long, the deal isn't done until the money is in the bank. And it taught me to be a lot less naive. And that's actually another reason why it was such a good idea for me, because I'm a natural optimist. And it's such a good idea for me to bring in someone like Lawrence, who is a lot more cautious. And even if the signs are there that things are going to go well, he will always think of the ways that it can go wrong. So I think that balance it works really well for us.
It's good when you see the light and your business partner sees the dark. So between the two of you, you'll probably work out what's going to happen next.
Exactly.
When you were going after funding, you had to do a business plan, presumably. So how did you do those forecasts and work out how much money you could make?
With great difficulty. It was a lot of just finger in the air and obviously trying to research what I could. I studied the RFID market, which I thought could be kind of similar in terms of the way that's gone out, and even though the pricing is higher, but there's very little information available about the very limited smart packaging market. So it was all kind of based on what we think we could sell the product at, and we always knew that it had to be very low cost for it to be able to scale, to have the impact that it needs to have. And just kind of, we try to take more of a bottom-up approach. So thinking about like, okay, here's the, say we're going to do red meat. Who sells the most red meat in the UK? Is it actually, from our contacts, is it feasible that we could work with them? And if we get that sale, how many units do they produce a year? What percentage of those units could we go into in the first year? If we convince them, maybe that could go up to onto 30% of their stock, and then 50%, and then maybe up to 90% of their stock. And then what does that mean for us? And how much do we need to pay everyone to produce it? Et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of, I think it's much easier when you're just entering a brand new area, to kind of take that bottom up and realistic approach. Your numbers will be smaller, but they will at least be believable and achievable.
And then I suppose you can always excel and outperform your numbers, and that's what investors want.
I think what also helped me, because I was initially having to work out these numbers before Lawrence and Laurie joined the company, but then after they joined, they actually had stories where they have kind of a real increase with a retailer going up from year 1 to year 2. And then investors ask, is that possible? And they have 3 examples of where, they're like, if they like something, yes, they will just ramp up sales and put it across all of their stores. So it's really nice having them in the room being like, yes, this is what happens in industry. So rather than me just speculating on what happens in industry. So I think that can't be really understated, really. You need that experience in the room, especially if you're dealing with kind of major retailers and food producers.
And how receptive have they been? You mentioned causing a big splash after the James Dyson Award, but how hard was it then to maintain that trajectory and get your foot in the door with big brands?
The strategy that I took is that I said yes to all of the speaking engagements that I got invited to. So that was mostly within kind of food innovation type conferences and seminars and that sort of thing. And I quickly realized that I only had to do like 5 to 10 events to until people felt, even though it was a very small bubble, but people who are in that bubble felt that I was everywhere. I think eventually you do start getting invites to meetings, and people do kind of wait behind to speak to you after your speaking engagement. And I think having something memorable like my red glasses doesn't hurt as well, kind of, and because if you've spoken to that person in the past and then you've seen them again at another conference, and if they're kind of a big person at a large company, they have a lot of people approaching them. And so having that kind of visual shortcut to like, I remember what we discussed last time, you're the label girl, kind of helps, and then builds that familiarity and that confidence to kind of bring you in and meet some other people in the company. So I think kind of a combination of being memorable and being a bit cheeky and just kind of like saying hello, even though they, you might be a bit too nervous, to say hello. You just like grit your teeth and just introduce yourself. And eventually, if you practice, what you do in 30 seconds, hopefully they'll be interested enough to find out some more, invite you to some meetings.
Visual shortcuts, I love that. How did you learn about that?
I did an A-level in psychology, so kind of learning about memory and the way the brain works, and kind of shortcuts is because the brain is lazy, it has to do a lot of stuff. So if you give it a chance to shortcut to something, it will take the shortcut. So knowing that, and I think I was realizing why people were remembering me, because people always commented on my glasses. So I was like, okay, these aren't going anywhere.
You seem so passionate about reducing food waste. Where does that come from?
As a Lithuanian, everyone has a first-hand or second-hand experience of food being rationed while Lithuania was under the Soviet regime. For me, that was my parents and grandparents that were under that. So I was certainly brought up in a way that you absolutely do not waste anything. Every grain of rice on your plate must be eaten. Otherwise, whatever you don't eat today, it's just going to be your next meal. So you better eat it now. Kind of coming to university for the first time, I before that point hadn't realised how much food waste was actually happening. And I think seeing particularly kind of students, not planning meals and that sort of thing, and just kind of following, having blind faith in expiry dates and not checking their food. I think that was particularly shocking to me. So that was on a small scale. But then I started working at the campus cafe, and that's when I started to get a glimpse into kind of industrial levels of waste, because at the end of the day in the cafe, everything that was past the date obviously had to be thrown away, but huge bin bags full of sandwiches, paninis, salads, all sorts were being chucked away. So I started saying, like, can I just take them with me? And the manager was like, yeah, whatever. So I started feeding my halls. It was like Wednesday nights, that's the night that I would close. So we'd feed all my corridor. I think that's when I realized, like, wow, how many cafes in the UK, and not just cafes, like it just started to open my mind about how much waste must be happening. And then when I looked into the expiry date project kind of later on, I was able to start picturing these numbers that I was reading about.
Because where do expiry dates even come from, and how are they calculated? It all seems really random.
The expiry date hasn't actually been around for too long, just under 50 years. It was actually brought in by Marks and Spencer, but it wasn't actually for the way that we use it now. They just wanted to print sell-by dates specifically just for staff to use. So they really wanted to be known as the supermarket that sells all the freshest food, because actually before that point, stock wouldn't be rotated. It would just stay on the shelves until it got sold, which actually is wonderful for food waste, but not so good for getting the freshest produce. So they were the first to actually start rotating stock and using these encoded dates. So word spread and consumers started like knowing where to look for these kind of secret dates. And so they were like, okay, well, let's just print them like big on the front of the pack. And they did a lovely marketing campaign about it. And it was just kind of out of a point of just like innovation, but not for the purpose that it was supposed to be at. And that's why still these days, a lot of people, older people might call them sell-by dates, because that's actually what they were. And then very quickly, the UK government thought that these were a lovely idea. And actually by that point, a lot of supermarkets had just kind of copied and brought them in. And so it just got legislated. And there was no foundation to how these get calculated, what they really mean, and that sort of thing. And then because around the same time, the UK was forming the EU, and they were kind of pulling together the most kind of interesting laws. The UK law of expiry dates just got kind of brought into the kind of EU countries and spread throughout Europe, and no one had actually considered, waste. What the definition is, how they should be calculated, and still to this day, in law, they are called dates of minimum durability, meaning that they have to be the worst case scenario. Well, they don't have to be, but it's recommended that they're the worst case scenario, and because you just don't know, with producing so many units, who's going to be the person who takes it home and actually doesn't refrigerate it. And they have to work to that worst case scenario, and it's kind of assuming that we're not going to keep our food properly. So that's why we're wasting so much good food.
So if Mimica is a massive success, how much waste could you eliminate? How much are we throwing away now because we think it's past its date? How big could this be?
In the UK, we throw away about 1/4 of the food that we buy. So that's like coming out of the supermarket with 4 bags of full products and then just leaving one of them in the car park every single week. So that's kind of mad to think about. And just by extending shelf life just by a couple of days, it can have a massive impact, because that's an extra couple of days gives you the chance to kind of find something at the back of the fridge and actually use it in time. And we know for perishable products, if you increase shelf life from 7 days by 2 days to 9 days, in-store waste gets cut in half. And waste in the home goes down by 63%. So just by increasing that by 2 days, it might be easy enough to just say, okay, well, why don't producers just do that increase? Job's done. But the issue is that you still don't know which of those units are not going to be held at the right temperature after they get purchased. So it's still a risk, and that's why we need individual level kind of freshness indication, which is what we're providing at Mimica.
So when are we going to see them on shelves? I know it takes a lot of development, but you must be chomping at the bit to see these in the real world.
Late last year, the UK government announced some grants to help businesses that are going to help the economy in the country kind of not just build back, but build back better. Because, this kind of, in a crisis, it's actually a good time for innovation, because when you kind of put processes back in place, we can make them more human-centered, sustainable. So I'm pleased to say that Mimica was the recipient of one of those grants. So that's what's that's going to fund is scaling up to pilot levels our first product, which is actually the label on top of a cap for juice. And we're going to be doing a small pilot of those mid this year. And then another project that we're starting this month with some major meat producers across Europe, not just in the UK. We're going to be scaling up our flat label specifically for red meat. And we'll be seeing a pilot on those in a couple of countries towards the end of this year.
That's so cool. Congratulations. That must feel like the culmination of years of hard work.
I can't wait. So when they first get produced on the line, I want to be there in the factory, seeing them off. Good luck.
Fly, my pretties. I want to ask about some of the things we touched on earlier. You mentioned, I applied for a patent. Oh my goodness, how tricky is that to do? How expensive? How can anyone listening get something patented? What's the process like?
Incredibly technical and fiddly, but I think there's two scenarios really. So if you're in the scenario that I was at the start, where you didn't have very much money, but you had a bit of time on your hands, actually filing a patent is almost free. I mean, I think it's £30 to actually do the filing. The reason why it's expensive is usually you want to work with a lawyer to write all of it, because they're going to make it watertight in terms of legal language and that kind of thing. And it's the lawyers that are expensive. So actually all the administration fees, they're not so bad. So what I did is that I basically studied the way, and there's specific rules, like literally like how big the margins have to be, etc., like the way the technical drawings are done. So I studied all of the rules and looked at loads of examples and basically wrote the first patent myself, and then paid a lawyer for an hour of his time to check it, and then sent it off. And actually within 12 months, you are allowed to make some amendments. So within that 12 months, and after it's filed, you can actually start talking about it, because you've got that what's called the priority date, and you can kind of get some grants in, or get a bank loan, whatever you want to do, and then actually pay that lawyer for a bit more of that time to kind of really upgrade it, and before that 12 months is up. So that's the way that I'd recommend. That's kind of like a hack to getting your idea protected. But we now have 2 patents. We filed the second patent for the cap product, and our lawyer did the whole thing, because it is ultimately much better, and it's going to be watertight. But I think especially if you're not sure if you are going to take something forward, I think writing it yourself is not a bad, you haven't got that much to lose.
And have you had to use it at all? Any copycats nibbling away at the edges there?
Not exactly what we're doing in terms of like with gels and texture change, but and even before we started, there's been kind of other solutions working on expiry date alternatives. So, the food industry is the largest industry in the world, and there's fantastic innovation happening at these other companies as well. And I think it's going to take a group effort. I think this is more of an industry shift. Like, it's not just going to be one solution on the market. So we see each other at smart packaging events, and we ask how it's going, and we share best practices.
Oh, that's great. And how did you manage to make inroads into an industry as regulated as food? There's lots of compliance. So did you have any outside help?
So the Food Standards Agency actually do some free online learning courses. So I did one about labelling regulation. So I think I would recommend just going straight to the source and learning the rules yourself, and you get a certification at the end. So in terms of like my specific thing, that's what worked for me. But then on top of that, I would bolster that with kind of asking, when I was at conferences, asking how that works in practice, and like, asking how do you actually calculate shelf life? What tests do you run? Because actually they're not completely made up numbers. They actually, of course, run shelf life tests and then calculate how much they want to add on to have the greatest risk minimized. So really interested in how they do that. And you need to be, you're right, you need to be really careful about what you write on the package and what you can say. The key thing is not to mislead consumers or confuse them, particularly as we're supplementing the printed date system.
Okay, that's good to know, and great advice about food standards. I didn't know that. When we were talking about fundraising earlier, when you're a startup, it can be hard to figure out the right valuation for your company. Anyone who's watched Dragon's Den will have seen that to and fro between the investors and the entrepreneur. So how did you value Mimica in the early days?
That's an interesting question. There's lots of different methodologies out there for how to calculate a valuation for a company that's not yet making any revenue, which is obviously where everyone starts out. I think after you're making revenue, it gets much easier. You just calculate multiples of your sales according to how quickly you think you can grow. But before that, You can take a top-down approach, you can take a bottom-up approach, you can take very complicated ones like how many senior people do you have in, and like how much IP do you have, and like I tried all of them, and every single time you get a different number. So in the end, of course, it is made up because it's just impossible to really do that any other way. And in the end, it's just what your investors are willing to pay and what they feel is good value and what is going to grow. So we, through a kind of a negotiation, ended up just agreeing a valuation with our early investors, and they've been pleased with it ever since, and we've been able to increase that value.
So would you say to start by going high, because there'll always be a negotiation and they'll try and knock you down?
Yeah, I mean, why not? Why not? I went in a pretty high valuation initially, and based on some like real numbers in terms of like the market and things that I thought we could achieve. But if it's too high for the people who are really supporting you, you need to bring it down a little. So I ended up kind of putting in a percentage of like, okay, well then, there's a percentage of risk here. So like, let's lower it by that percent. So we ended up coming to a valuation that we could all agree with, because I think what you really need to realize is that in that early stage, they're investing in the person. Whether or not you can make these specific numbers in the market, to be honest, like, the plan changes as soon as you write it down, because there's so many things you can't control. But if they believe that you took a logical way of working that out, and they believe in you, that you can actually go after and get these prospects that are going to make these numbers happen, that's the most important thing. And I think the fact that they kind of are made up numbers is beside the point. It's whether you used a logical process to get them, and you understand the unknowns that are going to affect those numbers as well.
It's like when you get points from your math teacher because you've shown the right workings out.
Yeah, most of it is showing up in attitude.
That's such great advice. So I want to go back and talk about how you've had to evolve in your confidence as an individual. You said that when you were young, you were picked on a bit, and yet now you are so confident and eloquent. Tell me how you got over the fears and the hang-ups from your youth.
I think one of the big things that helped me is I made a really good friend at the start of university who had absolute full confidence in herself at all times. And I think just being around her just kind of made that rub off on me, and realized that actually a lot of my hang-ups were not really founded. So I think that was a really big confidence boost. I think people showing interest in my design work, I think that helped boost my confidence as well. But I think in terms of public speaking in groups, and having that level of confidence, it's just really, it's practice. I want to say like, go watch my TED Talk, but I also want to say don't go watch my TED Talk, because I was so nervous, and it was the most awful talk I've ever given, because I was invited to give that really at the start of this journey. But I think a lot of people don't realize this, that most of developing a confidence in speaking is just showing up and doing it. And if you don't get the chance to kind of do a lot of public speaking, but then just in meeting situations or group situations, or if you're listening to a talk, being the first person, like daring yourself to just ask a question, and it's not going to be the best question because it's your first one, and then you ask another one, and that one will be slightly better and better phrased, and just kind of that practice. And I think, and also realizing when you're talking, when you're talking about your product or your solution, realizing that you need to get over yourself. They're listening to what you're saying. They're not particularly kind of interested in like your weird mannerisms or that kind of thing. I mean, obviously try to keep those at bay, but they're here because they're interested in what you are doing. And if you are passionate about what you are doing, you won't need notes, and you'll just keep doing it, and then one day people will start complimenting you on your speaking skills, and you'll think, where did that come from?
I love that notion of confidence being like a muscle, and the more you use it, the stronger it gets.
Yeah, definitely.
And having been a promiscuous mentee, as you call it, do you now do any mentoring yourself?
Yes, I do. I think it's so, I never forget the people who helped me take my first steps. So wherever I see an opportunity where I feel like I can teach people about the first grants that they can apply for, or I can help someone kind of figure out what's the easiest way to get some prototypes manufactured, I will take the opportunity to meet with someone and continue to meet with them. And I think it's not just kind of giving the advice. I always try to vouch for them as well. So if I spot a competition that they should be applying for, I do that. And if there's like nominations for kind of upcoming entrepreneur, I will nominate people who I'm mentoring. So it's also kind of talking about what they're doing in rooms where they might not be in yet. So kind of being an advocate is as important as being a mentor.
You mentioned way back when that you did this internship, and clearly there was a path you envisioned that was ultimately working for someone else. How does it feel to have taken a different route? Was this a more rewarding choice, do you think?
While it's been much harder and much longer than I thought it would ever be, I think I'd be a fool not to choose this path again, because the speed at which I've been able to become a much more well-rounded person, and the networks that I've built and the kind of exciting opportunities. I mean, most of it is really hard work and it's very rewarding, but you do actually sometimes end up in really cool situations, like being invited to Houses of Parliament and getting to travel as well back in the olden days. So there are definitely really cool moments as well, and I wouldn't trade the well-rounded professionally person that I've become today. But even though I'd love to get back to doing more design work in the future.
Oh well, we'll have to watch this space. Sol, you've been amazing, and I almost feel like I could take a crazy idea in my head and turn it into something in the real world. I would also call you for advice, of course. You have been sublime at sharing every step of the journey and giving us all the shortcuts, or the hacks as you call them. Thank you so much.
It's been my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you're on YouTube, give us a like and a comment below, and please subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Head over to sage.com/podcast if you'd like to learn more about the themes or about Sol. The show notes are all now on there too. Thanks again, and catch you soon for more sound advice.